So now on to the organizer part, so to speak. My talk is quite different to the ones before. It's a very opinionated talk in that sense. And it's also a talk that goes more across the intersections of different kinds of perspective taking, rather going in depth into one. Although at the same time, of course, there will also be some great hits as we announce. So I call it Noetic and Experiential Roots to Perspective Taking. It's a title that's ultimately wrong. I will hopefully convince you of that in the end. So I kind of wanted to phenomenologically analyze what it means to engage in perspective taking and how we as researchers do this across fields. Let's start with two definitions. These are consciously broad. So this is one by Erle and Caruso. Perspective taking is the ability to intuit another person's thoughts, feelings, and inner mental states. And well, what do we mean by that? So inner mental states, we discussed this a bit before. What counts as a mental state? So usually when researchers say that, well, when we talk about intuiting somebody's thoughts, this is the, oh, sorry, first another definition about functionally. This didn't come up so far today. So perspective taking also means overcoming one's egocentrism. We trust Mark Davis, one of the great research legends in social psychology of perspective taking, successfully overcoming one's egocentrism in favor of a different point of view. I think we can agree for the most part on these dimensions. And now we can finally discuss what mental states do we talk about. As I said, thoughts, that's usually the cognitive perspective taking. When we try to intuit somebody's thoughts, it's the classic theory of mind kind of research. Again, this is a bit of a heuristic framework that I'm painting here, but I'm calling this cognitive perspective taking, the sense, the substrate of the perspective taking process. It's a cognitive one, thought, a belief. And we have, of course, intuiting people's feelings, which is a classic topic in empathy research or emotion research, when it's more about like understanding why somebody is sad, how we can help them. This is more of an affective process. And then the inner mental states, not to offend all the people who spoke today, that's why I put the visual spatial perspective taking, which is also kind of my home discipline. But that's a bit hard, so it doesn't get its own denomination here. So let's look at these fields and how they investigate perspective taking. Let's start with the empathy researchers. This is the classic empathy perspective taking paradigm. So basically, you as participants in my study get to read a story. This is usually a horrible story. Something bad happened to you. You got HIV, or your parents died in a car accident. And before you read this story, the researcher will give you instructions. There's the so-called imagine self-perspective taking instruction, which boils down to basically imagine you are the person in the story you're about to read. And there's the so-called imagine other perspective taking instruction, which is more think about how the person in the story might think or feel about what's happening to them. And then, of course, we have a control instruction, which basically says, just read the story, remain objective, and tell me what this feels like. In empathy research, what you usually find is that people identify following either instruction with the person in the story. So whether I imagine being in that story or whether I think about that person, I always feel more similar to the target in the story. I feel more sympathy for that person. I align my beliefs and my feelings with whatever is happening in that story. So that's perspective taking. I take in attributes of the other person. Of course, there are also important differences. The imagined self-perspective taking is supposed to be a more simulation-based experience. So here what happens is I imagine, okay, my parents died in a car accident. That's of course horrible. I use that experience, like, oof, this was horrible. This person might feel like I just felt. So I create a proxy representation and I use that to make a judgment about the mental state of another person. If I think about that person, it's kind of the opposite in an ironic way. So here, my judgment about the mental state of the other person is, well, kind of based on my personal knowledge. Okay, this happened to that person. I'm not identifying with the situation right now. What do I know about the world? If somebody's parents died, it's usually a sad occasion. So I guess this person is sad. So this is a projection rather than a simulation. So we're not using experiences to inform our judgment, but rather knowledge that we have. What about theory of mind research? Well, here we have more like families of tasks rather than families of experiential manipulation. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm also not qualified to do that. But I hope this is a non-offensive statement that the two main competing approaches to theory of mind are usually still this theory and the simulation theory. And to cut this a bit short, it's basically the same idea again as we just saw in the empathy debate. A theorist of theory of mind, say that 10 times quickly, would be someone who says like we make predictions like a theorist about the world to predict mental states in others. And a simulation theorist would again say, well, we simulate the situation of somebody else and that informs us about their likely mental state. And then we come to the spatial cognition research, and Klaus, you will be flattered. I don't have Guns N' Roses. These are similar.
It's not even a fresh one.
It's books and bananas. Doesn't have quite the same ring as Guns N' Roses. But we heard about level 1 perspective taking, so we can draw occluders into these stimuli, and we can see whether something is visible or not. We learned about line of sight tracking, and we learned that this is a rather egocentric process. It doesn't matter where the other person is located relative to us. I can solve this task wherever the person sits, wherever I stand. The only thing I need to know is an occluder is a barrier that blocks me. That's the only rule I have to follow. But there's of course also level 2 perspective taking, and we already learned about bodies and other merging that happens here. So basically people transform their body schema into the position of the other person to solve tasks that are level 2 perspective. So what it boils down to, this is why I call it noetic and simulated processes. We can look at all fields of research that engage with perspective taking, and we will find families of theories, of tasks, of manipulation that kind of hinge on the assumption that we use knowledge to predict mental states in others. Whether that's a theory, I make a prediction about the world, whether that's imagine other perspective taking, or whether that's line of sight tracking. In the broadest sense, social cognitively speaking, this is all judgments about another person's mental state based on predictions, based on my personal knowledge. And the simulation on the other side is the opposite. Here, I'm not using knowledge, rather, I'm using experiences to inform my mental state guess of another person. This, if I use my knowledge to predict your mental state, ultimately is an egocentric process, in my view. It's probably now we're getting into the territory of offensive statement. I said it's an opinionated thought, whereas an experience that I create surrounding the situation of somebody else is an other-centered. So if we go back to the initial functional definition of perspective taking, what we end up saying, or what I end up saying here, is kind of like this should be counted as perspective taking, and this actually is not really perspective taking, more so than egocentric projection, or however we want to call it. Get back to the implication of that later. Now, the curious case of perspective taking, this was the starting point of my research, and I know that Klaus doesn't like this. When I invited him to this workshop, I paid him some compliments in an email. He said, like, don't do that. I really, really hate that. But he's a very inspirational figure, and now he can't fight me back because I'm the speaker here. So Klaus' work was really, really inspirational for me when it comes to this, because if you look at cognitive and affective perspective taking, how this exactly happens, what does an instruction do with someone cognitively? That's not very well established. What people are quite ready to say is that these things are related. So we have cognitive empathy or affective theory of mind, and these are kind of the same. So there's a lot of talk between these fields without a strong focus on the mechanisms that would connect them. And then visual spatial perspective taking is kind of left alone. Although, as I pointed out before, the constructs involved in these three kinds of perspective taking are kind of similar. We're always talking about knowledge or simulation. And these slides I can skip. So I wanted to explain class study once again. So yeah, you have the results here. Oh, fuck off. The premise of this whole thing is basically, yeah, we can also skip my own research on this. Basically, what Klaus and Andy's and many other people's research program boils down to is that what happens during visual spatial perspective taking, if the angular disparity gets high enough, is people do this embodied transformation. Not all people, but many. And if it's below, people are egocentric. They can solve this task with their own perspective, like in Klaus's new task, where we predicted no difference at 0 degrees of angular disparity. So we have a case of embodied self-other merging. And if you think about what I said in the beginning about these empathy instructions that create a feeling of similarity, of sympathy, of merging, of unison to the other person, my research program started with the premise, well, isn't this very similar to each other? So this is a literal merging between the self and the other. And if we trust the premise of embodied cognition, a construct such as similarity is grounded in a physical experience, right? And the physical experience of merging with somebody else could be the mode grounding of the similarity that people perceive if you instruct them to imagine being someone else. So we can look at relations between these constructs. And the first thing I did very simply, so far we used this as a measure of reaction times. I use this task as a manipulation. If I show you this picture and ask you where's the banana, you can solve this egocentrically, easy, left. If I show you this picture, you kind of have to do perspective taking. So this is where we can produce, where we can experimentally manipulate that people engage in embodied self-other merge. And following these trials, people did this for a long time, 10, 20, 80 trials, depending on the study. I asked them questions after these trials. So how similar do you feel after doing this, after remaining egocentric? How similar do you feel to this person after you took that person's visual perspective, after you merged with that person in embodied sense? Did the same thing with sympathy, and I can show you that usually visual spatial perspective taking induces feelings of similarity, of sympathy, of many other things that basically ran through all the empathic outcomes that we know from perspective taking. So kind of the idea, okay, so this embodied aspect in visual spatial perspective taking can explain some variants that we also know from other simulated kinds of perspective taking. And what I then set out to do is that, well, if we have this link so well established, we can think about a whole lot of other links, and I'm just going to run through some of the studies about this. So what I'm not going to show, but what I did in the past is we also did some correlational studies. They're not so interesting. Basically, the abilities on these three kinds of perspective taking. If people are good at one kind, they're usually also good at the others. Not huge correlations, rather small correlations actually, but they are there. What I found more interesting was like experimentally manipulating. So do people, when we make them take the visual spatial perspective of somebody else, do they also take in the beliefs of that person? And it's the same experimental setup. We have some trials where people remain egocentric, and we have some trials, various levels of angular disparity, where we make them merge with the other person visual spatially. And then we ask them a bunch of funny trivia questions. This is research I did for my PhD in Würzburg. That's a white wine region. So not most, but some of the questions were about white wine. How many calories are in a glass of wine? Anybody, any idea? That's the point of the thing. These are questions where you don't have an answer ready. We gave them, however, an answer that emanates as the mental state from this person. And our idea was simply, well, if this embodied self-other merging also makes us merge more in the cognitive sense with the other person, people should say something very close to 82 calories in this condition, whereas here, there would be a random noise. They would just say what their egocentric opinion was. This is indeed what we find. So I show you the plot once by angular disparity. So you can see there's like a drop as soon as the embodied transformation starts. And on the right side, you see how we actually analyze the data. So basically, the three black bars make this. This is all the conditions where people have to mentally move into the other person's position. And these two bars make up the white bar, where people can remain egocentric. And what is plotted here is the difference in judgments. So that's why the bars get lower. If that person says 82 and I say 83 calories in Silvana, that's a very small difference. So our opinion is very similar. If she says 82 and I say 550 calories, that's a large difference. So clearly I didn't listen to what she had to say. So that's some indication that people, by purely visual spatial means, can also take in beliefs another person. Next thing we did was about emotions. Can we adopt emotional states of others? Here we changed the paradigm a bit. So no more Guns and Roses, no more books and bananas. Now we just have balls and balls. The idea is basically you have to identify the blue or the yellow ball either from your perspective or from the perspective of the target. We had to change it like this because we needed people to see her emotional facial expression. Here she's happy, but we also had a condition where she was sad or where she had no emotional expression at all. And the idea is as soon as people react to the visual spatial task, they were asked how they felt. And the idea is, okay, she's happy. I just merged with her visual spatially. I should feel more happy now as well. If she's sad, I merged with her. I should feel more sad. Here the results are a bit more mixed. So basically we found what we expected here for the sadness condition. So you can see how people feel goes down, so they feel worse. And they took the visual spatial perspective of someone who was sad. We didn't find that for joy, so we expected that this goes up. We discussed why that might be. Joy is less contagious than sadness, apparently, although clearly this was not our prediction. And for neutral, well, we didn't find a difference because you can't contage someone with neutrality and can't be more neutral than neutral. So that was also expected. So even though it is not as consistent as the findings for the cognitive parameters, still, at least on some affective mental states, we find it's really good. Now, the funny thing about this paradigm, why I like this book when I'm paradigm so much, is you can use it as an experimental manipulation. This is what I did so far. You can also use it as a measure, which is what's coming up next. And this is some more recent work where we looked at whether we can affect the visual spatial perspective taking process with affective parameters. So here the idea is people complete this, Guns N' Roses paradigm. And the only thing we manipulated was before they started doing this, we said, oh, wait, before you start, we want to show you the target of this task. This is the person you will be seeing. Some information about her, she's HIV positive. Not nice, aversive. This is kind of from the empathy literature, the manipulation now used to affect visual spatial rather than empathic perspective taking performance. So the idea here was initially that if you learn that someone is aversive in a negative state, that makes it harder. Maybe people are reluctant or not able to merge with that person in an embodied sense. That was the hypothesis here. And to tease that out, we instructed people either to imagine being the HIV positive person or to remain objective when they learn. And then we just measured how well they do the perspective taking task. What we find was actually exactly the opposite of prediction. So first, as a manipulation check, yeah, our empathy induction, the imagine self perspective taking instruction still works. If we look at the reaction time, so the metric I used here for the analysis is basically the difference between egocentric and perspective taking trials. That's an indicator of how long does it take to engage in perspective taking. This is also what taught in do. And we can see that these differences are quite different. So it takes way longer to take the visual spatial perspective if we just imagine being that person, which is, I will be honest, completely the opposite of what we predicted. We are currently, or I will at some point have to find out why that is. Currently, my working hypothesis here is that the distress that this causes might, for example, as Andrew just said, momentarily incapacitate people to perform a cognitively demanding task. It's a speed reaction time task. Maybe if I'm too distressed, I cannot do that properly. But here we don't really know what causes this rather substantially, actually. And then lastly, and this is under review right now, so I also wanted to do a study where I manipulate perceived similarity between the target and the perspective taker and whether that affects visual spatial perspective taking performance. The problem I ran into was whenever you, so as a good social psychologist, nothing replicates in social psychology except social identity theory, apparently. As soon as you convince people that they're similar to someone, they like that person. You cannot get around it. So I kind of couldn't tease the affective and the cognitive apart. So what I did was, okay, then as a last resort, let's just do an observational study on this. So I kind of meta-analyzed most of the experiments I showed you before. I put all the data together. So we're talking about a sample of 2,000 participants, 100,000 perspective-taking trials, egocentric perspective-taking trials, very large data set. And the idea here was, so we can compare female and male participants and how they react to female and male targets. Usually we can't do that because there's only 5 males in each study. But here we had a lot. So it was like 700 men and 1,500 women. So large power, and the prediction was, of course, well, men are better with men, women are better with women. But this is not what we found. So the only thing you can learn from this might be interesting for Klaus. The only thing we learned, so this is a great graph, it's nothing. You see a lot of data points. The only thing that's in there, and you have to trust me on this, is that women are just better at this than men, both egocentrically and perspective taking, women are faster than men. They're especially faster at perspective taking. So this is kind of the Asian participant pattern that you had in your study, although these were mostly Westerns. So it's an interesting test bed in the sense that, well, this is a large sample. Usually we derive our power from trial repetition. Here for inter-individual differences, it's probably the best data set out there to test gender effects on perspective taking. But in terms of similarity, this is of course very sobering. So similarity does not matter at all for visual spatial perspective taking speed. Although none of the studies that went into this meta-analysis were designed to test that. So this could also just mean nobody paid attention to the target gender because that was not task relevant for the perspective taking. So the jury here is open. If somebody has a good similarity manipulation that does not cause people to like other people, I would be very curious to hear about that. And then lastly, some discussion findings. So what does it mean? Usually people take issue with the fact that, well, okay, so now you're saying only simulated processes are perspective taking. Well, what's with the other ones? So while I would still contend that noetic processes technically should not be called perspective taking because they are deeply egocentric in my point of view, it doesn't mean they're like asocial, non-social cognitive processes. They're just other means of understanding others. So when I heard Ian's talk, for example, earlier today, to me that was a very, very clear example of a task that people, why would I guess what somebody else is thinking about New York's areas and where to meet them? Of course, people go with their own best guess. Or when we're talking about English newspapers, I don't know most of the newspapers that were shown in this graph. I will never say the Daily Mail or whatever it was called, because it's not part of my vocabulary. So clearly, the best solution for this task is I use whatever I have, and then I kind of try to align that subsequently with other people. What should be criticized about my work so far, and other people, for example, Anna Vela, back, doing much better than me. So this is a very, very broad picture that I'm painting. I did not pay attention on different subcomponents within these domains or task characteristics. These are things that came up in previous talks. Or different strategies that are likely used for different tasks. So one explanation for these findings on effective perspective taking, for example, would be, why would I engage? Why would I reason about the mental state of another person if I see that person is smiling? Maybe that is hard to change because a smile is quite an iconic sign of happiness. So maybe some effortful guessing of the mental state of another person is simply not likely when I'm faced with a problem. How is a person feeling that is smiling at me? So people who have more time, who are smarter than me, should look into these characteristics, because ultimately I think that likely determines the major variance in perspective taking performance on all tasks, visual, spatial, affective, cognitive. And for the noetic processes, just to quickly go over this, why I refrain from studying them is mainly because I think using the definition that or the taxonomy that I generated here, these must be more eclectic than simulation. Simulation is kind of the parameters set. I need to use some medium, my body or whatever it is, and transpose that in somebody else. Noetic processes are theoretically unbounded, in my view, which is probably why they are hard to study as a unit. Obviously, I don't say they're not important to understand others, but I would still contend that they should be removed from our perspective taking vocabulary. So it should not be second-person perspective taking again. It should be something else, in my view. Anyways, because I think they usually work based on the projection, egocentric knowledge, which is kind of the opposite, taking something from somebody. That's it.
Thanks a lot. I have two questions. First, regarding like the idea that this using these rules is an egocentric method. It's less effortful, that's true, but it's rules that are socially shared, so that you obtain through social interactions that you guessed by observing others. So can you really say it's egocentric? It's really made of social contact and social observation.
So I would be careful so egocentric is not meant in the sense of like it's cognitively less effortful. It might be also more heuristic. That's true. Egocentric in the sense, so as an extreme philosophical example, imagine an alien comes to our planet that doesn't know what smiling means. That person will reason about the mental state of others completely differently because their knowledge about the world is different. So when somebody smiles at that alien, they will be like, I don't know what it means. So in that sense, whatever is inside my head, I project onto others. But the source for my judgment about the mental state of another person resides here. So whatever is in there can potentially determine what I think somebody else thinks. In that sense, I need egocentric.
Yeah, the second question, sorry.
Yeah. Thanks. I have to think. So yeah, the experimental task where you're trying to induce the merging.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell whether it's because they're making the effort, or whether it's because they succeeded at doing the perspective taking?
Yeah. So for these experiments, I mean, we obviously take some precautions. So any trial where people do this wrong is excluded from all the cognitive and affective analyses because we cannot be sure whether they engage in perspective taking or whether they remain egocentric. We analyze, of course, the reaction time and accuracy patterns, and we usually replicate also these findings. That it takes longer and people are less accurate when they have to take perspectives. But this is an assumption that is true. I mean, this is a robust effect. I think all the people who did their research can attest to that. But so this is, for example, something that Annabella encountered in her research that she does for a PhD. This assumption is made in good faith, and if you have enough people in your studies, so in social psychology we usually overpower studies now, you kind of can fight off that noise. But what we discover now is roughly 1/3 of participants say, if you ask them, no, I don't do this third rotation. So this is an assumption baked in, and I mean, these are aggregate statistics that are reported here, but individually that's true. I mean, you would know there is probably a lot of variance how people solve the class. And this is all valid on the sample level. If you would model this with like individual slopes, random slopes, it would probably tell somewhat different.
Yeah, I think the reverse is also true, basically, that you could actually use a simulation approach basically to solve when you're being instructed to just project your egocentric knowledge onto someone else. So some people might be more inclined to actually then fall into a simulation process, because that's how they normally empathize with others on a cognitive level. That's also cannot be ruled out, just as a comment.
Yeah, I agree. But looking at the empathy literature, sorry, I add a comment. I think that might happen because sometimes, especially for these dire situations that you encounter in empathy research a lot, I think that can actually be more. I've never encountered this. What do I know about using currents? But I can imagine how horrible this is. So this is often more informative than what I can deduce about the world. However, people are also super reluctant to do this. I don't want to imagine stuff that is horrible because it causes me pain unless my altruistic motivation is so high that I'm willing. I'm taking this hit because I want to benefit you. And I can only apparently understand how you feel by putting myself into this bad situation. So maybe I can help you better. So there's a very costly behavior that sometimes can be more accurate. But I would say usually like in the setups that I have where the other person is unknown, if it's a bad experience, I don't think people simulate loss.
I have too many questions. I'm going to see other people.
With your white wine trivia study,
Yes.
Did you test whether they're moving more closely to the beliefs of that other that they see when they are doing the self-rotation, specifically to that person, or would they be just more generally open to including other information in their judgments, regardless of whether it emanates from that specific person?
So we tested this actually also with an empty chair paradigm. So we kind of induced them to do the embodied rotation part, but there was no social agent, and then they just showed no difference to the control condition.
I will ask one of my questions. I really like your phenomenon, the whole when you embody someone, and you're very careful with your language. You talk about. I mean, you've used cognitive perspective taking here, but really it's an approximation to someone else's idea about the world. Not quite the same as a belief, but is it an in-group effect that embodiment is creating? So when you embody someone, do they become a bit more in-group and thereby their view and your view are more likely to be aligned?
I think it's a good reading of the data I've accumulated. I think it is also possible, depending on what your dependent measure is, to argue against this. But for now, given the evidence I have, I would say that this is
Yeah, wants to massacre you.
But just a quick comeback on the shelling game. So if you ask people simply to say what the obvious answer is from their own perspective, they give a different answer from the last one. So it can't be that people respond eccentrically on that task. I mean, it isn't the case that they respond eccentrically. You get a different distribution of answers if you ask people just what's most obvious to them. So I think I would contend that it does involve perspective taking insofar as you have to give a response, or rather what people do is give a response that's different from perspective. So that's just a point of information, because that's just kind of
fair enough.
I guess I sort of brought a comment that I had. I mean, this isn't it's prompted by your talk, but it's not directed at you in particular, and maybe but it might provoke a bit of discussion. So I think the whole simulation versus theory debate in relation to theory of mind is deeply problematic. So no one has articulated the theory that people use if they use theory. Right? There is no theory that gets you from that predicts what someone's going to think given some starting conditions. All we have are sort of a few common sense platitudes about how beliefs and desires interact with each other. So theory simply doesn't work. It's just a bad theory. Simulation isn't a great alternative, or rather, what it does, maybe it's a good alternative, except it ignores one of the most important problems, which is figuring out how you start simulation in the first place. So it works quite nicely if you have a sort of very broad brush, I think, like what imagining parents are like. But actually, if you think about it for a particular person, then actually they might not care, they might not have liked their parents. Or it might be that any number of other conditions would change. And so in order for simulation theory to work, you need to condition it according to a whole bunch of knowledge. So I think it's a really unhelpful dichotomy in the literature, actually. And given that, I'm not sure whether the mapping that you have works quite as nicely as it appears to when you presented it there, because the theory of mind literature is letting you down. The others might work better.
Yeah, I mean, so the point is, so this is what I meant when I said, so I agree on the theory. Basically, there's a bunch of eclectic rules how people use their knowledge to do this. There is no system to this. Because
there isn't a theory. It's not even that there's no system. It just doesn't work. It can't work. No one's told you what the rules are. I mean, there is no set of rules that gets you the right answer.
It's basically reason.
Yeah. No, but no, there isn't. It can't be just reasoning because there isn't a set of rules. I think that's for that. There is no theory that expresses. So for grammar, right? We have a theory of grammar that tells you what the words and rules are and what their rules of combination are. There's nothing analogous for theory of mind.
That is the point. So I think different people will approach this problem differently, which is, yes, it's not a theory, but this is also what science is, for example. If you ask 10 theory of mind researchers in the same room what theory of mind is, they give you a different answer. There is no reason or no objective truth about this. People have different views and they solve the problem differently. So this is why I agree. Like, this will be different for people who kind of want to achieve the same goal. How they get there, can call it again noetic, knowledge-based, whatever. But this is basically, I just need a term for this that signifies, yeah, they're using their brains. And that's about what we can say. For the simulation, I would be a bit more strict when it comes to this. So what is important here is, so this is what went wrong with social psychology for many years, is that we abused this embodiment paradigm in the sense that, like, oh, any concept can be somehow simulated. That makes no sense. I mean, you have to listen a bit to like people who have talked about this a long time ago. Merleau-Ponty, for example, who has the strong idea that, well, the things that you do over and over in a specific physical way will become part of the concept. A child, as we learned earlier today, cannot solve the 3 mountains task. They have to walk around because they're done. They grow up and learn, oh, I can actually skip the walking, use my brains a bit more. But at that point, the simulative process is of course already deeply ingrained because this is the physical activity that we did until we could abstract it. So here we have a rule where it makes sense. It's a physical proximity that we create, and we can apparently stretch that to the extent to non-physical proximity, aka similarity. And in the arena of social cognitive activities, that is a sensible core simulative property. You also have this in nature, like you have this test tropic paper. So some things are always the same. So quantity is the snark effect, for example. Y is up, y are large numbers up or to the right and small numbers are low. But if I have one stone, that's a bit high. If I have two stones, that's higher, 3 stones, 4 stones, 5 stones. This is a rule. This is why we have this spatial numerical responsible association. That is just how the world works. Psychologists are really bad at identifying what makes sense, in my view, as a general simulation principle. But here, given how our bodies are constructed, asymmetrical, kind of know where the front and the back is, here I would contend that this proximity is a sensible simulation. But that does not explain any kind of mental state. And this is what I meant. This cannot be the solution to, for example, the problem like where will I meet someone in New York? Yeah, imagining where they're standing in the room does not help me there. So very deep theory of money. I agree with you that the literature is a mess. Maybe where people should adopt a novelty. I don't want to infringe on our copyright too much. I have to cut off myself. I'm happy to answer more questions. And we had one point. I forgot, however, what it was that we wanted. Ah, yeah, about dinner. We haven't decided. Do we know when we go to dinner?
7. Well, actually, we could go earlier but it depends on if people want to go first at the hotel and come back, or we can have drinks straight after the talks and then start eating.
Oh, we all agree.
I think we kind of have to make the decision as a group now. So now we feel it.
Well,
I vote.
we all start eating at 7, and people can do whatever they want, and they can drink before. At least they can be also freedom, but
There can be no freedom. Okay, fair enough. So we meet at 7 at the location that's.
yeah, right. You're right that I should show everybody. Right. So what we can do is that after the talks, I can show you the place to everybody, and then we see some. Yeah, after a while, and some of us we go straight inside.
Is that agreeable to all? Then we can finally have coffee. Thank you.